The shadow of absolute obedience. In the final days of April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed into its own inferno, Berlin had become a necropolis of shattered ambitions. The city that once hosted torchlit parades celebrating the Führer's vision now burned under relentless Soviet artillery. In the claustrophobic bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler had retreated into a realm of delusion, where phantom armies still existed on maps, where victories could be conjured through sheer force of will, and where loyalty was measured not by reason, but by blind obedience unto death. It was in this tomb of concrete and madness that Hitler issued one of his most catastrophic commands. On April 21, 1945, with Red Army forces tightening their noose around the capital, the Führer summoned his remaining generals to demand the impossible, a counter-offensive that would break the Soviet encirclement and save Berlin. The instrument of this salvation, he declared, would be SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner and his hastily assembled Detachment Steiner, a formation that existed more in Hitler's imagination than in battlefield reality. Felix Steiner was not a typical product of the SS apparatus. Born in 1896 in East Prussia, he had entered military service during World War I, where the trenches had taught him lessons about warfare that would later set him apart from the ideological fanatics who dominated the Schutzstaffel. While Heinrich Himmler's SS had evolved into an instrument of racial terror and genocidal implementation, Steiner had approached military command with a pragmatist's eye. He valued tactical innovation over ideological purity, combat effectiveness over political theater. Throughout the war, Steiner had earned a reputation as a capable, if controversial, commander. He had pioneered combined arms tactics within the Waffen SS, transforming units like the SS Division Viking into relatively effective fighting forces. Unlike many of his SS counterparts who viewed soldiers as expendable tools in a racial crusade, Steiner understood that men were not merely ideological abstractions, they were human beings whose lives carried weight. This perspective would become critically important in the apocalyptic spring of 1945. By April, Detachment Steiner was a formation in name only. What Hitler envisioned as an elite striking force capable of reversing Germany's fate was, in brutal reality, a patchwork assembly of depleted units, untrained recruits, and Luftwaffe ground personnel who had never been intended for frontline combat. Steiner commanded approximately 15,000 men, but many were barely trained teenagers and middle-aged conscripts armed with inadequate weapons. They lacked ammunition, fuel, heavy equipment, and most critically, any realistic chance of success against the battle-hardened Soviet forces that had already fought their way from Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin. The order from the Führer was explicit and maniacal in its demands. Steiner was to attack immediately, break through Soviet lines north of Berlin, and link up with other German forces to encircle and destroy the Red Army units besieging the capital. Failure was not an option. Hesitation would be considered treason. The order carried the implicit threat that had hung over every German commander since the July 20th assassination attempt. Disobedience meant execution, not just for the commander, but potentially for his family as well. In the Nazi command structure, orders from Hitler were treated as sacred pronouncements. The cult of the Führer demanded absolute submission. Generals who had once been respected military professionals had been reduced to terrified subordinates, nodding along to strategic fantasies while their armies disintegrated. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's closest military advisors, had long since abandoned any pretense of honest counsel, transforming themselves into yes-men who validated every delusion emanating from the bunker. But Felix Steiner found himself facing an impossible equation. To obey Hitler's order meant sending thousands of men, boys really, many of them, into a suicide attack that would accomplish nothing beyond adding to the already astronomical death toll. The military situation was beyond salvage. Germany had lost the war. Every military professional understood this fundamental reality, even if speaking it aloud constituted defeatism punishable by death. Steiner studied the maps, he assessed his forces, he calculated the odds, and in that moment of terrible clarity, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life while simultaneously marking him as something rare in the final days of the Third Reich, a man who chose humanity over ideology, survival over suicide, reason over the madness of absolute obedience. What makes Steiner's stories so compelling is not simply that he refused an order, it's that he refused the foundational principle upon which the entire Nazi system was constructed. The SS, more than any other organization in Hitler's regime, had been built on the concept of unconditional loyalty. Meine Ehre heißt Treue, my honor is loyalty, was not merely a motto, but a religious commandment. To be SS meant to obey without question, to execute orders without moral hesitation, to prioritize the Führer's will above all ethical considerations.
The anatomy of refusal. On April 22, 1945, Felix Steiner made the decision that would define his legacy. He did not attack. His forces remained in their positions north of Berlin, and the great counteroffensive that existed only in Hitler's feverish imagination never materialized. In the bunker, as the hours passed without news of Steiner's assault, Hitler's rage transformed into something far more unsettling, a complete psychological collapse that would mark the beginning of his final descent. When informed that Steiner had not launched the attack, Hitler's reaction was volcanic. Witnesses described a man unraveling in real time, his face turning crimson, spittle flying as he screamed accusations of betrayal and cowardice. He tore off his glasses and threw them across the room. For the first time, those present heard the Führer admit what had been obvious to everyone else for months. The war was lost. Germany was finished. Everyone had betrayed him, the generals, the party, the German people themselves. In Hitler's diseased worldview, the failure was never his own. It was the weakness and treachery of those around him. But what exactly had Steiner refused? This question is more complex than it initially appears. Steiner did not issue a formal declaration of disobedience. He did not surrender to the Soviets. He did not stage a coup or publicly denounce the regime. Instead, he engaged in what might be called passive refusal, a form of resistance that operated in the gray zones of military command, where delays could be justified by tactical concerns, where communication failures could explain inaction, where the chaos of collapsing command structures provided cover for intentional non-compliance. Steiner later claimed he simply lacked the resources to execute the order. His units were too weak, too scattered, too poorly equipped. This was objectively true, but it was also convenient. Many commanders throughout the war had attacked with insufficient forces because Hitler demanded it, and the price of their obedience was measured in mass graves and gutted divisions. What made Steiner different was his willingness to prioritize the survival of his men over the theater of symbolic resistance. This decision existed within a broader pattern of Steiner's wartime conduct. Unlike SS commanders such as Theodor Eicke or Oskar de Leerwanger, whose units became synonymous with atrocities and whose leadership styles embraced brutality as both method and ideology, Steiner had maintained a more conventional military professionalism. He had opposed certain ideological excesses within the SS, arguing that combat effectiveness should take precedence over racial doctrine in military matters. This had earned him both respect from some quarters and suspicion from SS ideological purists, who viewed him as insufficiently committed to National Socialist principles. The tactical reality Steiner faced was stark. Soviet forces north of Berlin were overwhelming in numbers and firepower. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front had already punched through German defensive lines with devastating efficiency. These were not the same Soviet forces that had stumbled in 1941. These were battle-hardened armies, equipped with lessons learned through years of brutal combat, supported by artillery concentrations that could reduce German positions to moonscapes within hours. To attack into this maelstrom with inadequate forces would not have been bravery, it would have been murder. Steiner understood this with the clarity that came from years of military experience. But understanding the futility of an order and refusing to execute it were separated by an abyss of personal risk. In the Nazi system, disobedience was treason, and treason meant death. What protected Steiner, at least temporarily, was the collapse of the command structure itself. Communications were breaking down, chain of command was fragmenting, Berlin was encircled. Hitler was trapped in his bunker, increasingly divorced from reality. The mechanisms of enforcement that had kept the Wehrmacht and SS in line throughout the war, the threat of courts-martials, execution squads, retribution against families, were losing their power as the regime itself disintegrated. Yet even in collapse, the Nazi apparatus retained its capacity for violence against its own. General Helmut Weidling, the commander of Berlin's defenses, was initially condemned to death in absentia for supposed retreat without orders, only to be later reinstated when he proved he had been following proper military procedure. Scores of officers and soldiers were executed by flying courts-martials in the final weeks, hanged from lampposts with signs declaring them cowards and traitors. The system's death throes were often as lethal as its peak power. Steiner's refusal thus represented an enormous gamble. He was betting that the regime's collapse would occur faster than its ability to punish him. He was wagering that Hitler's grip on reality was loosening enough that orders might be lost in the chaos, that other priorities might override the enforcement of this particular command. Most critically, he was calculating that the military situation was so cataclysmic that even SS leadership might recognize the futility of the attack. In the bunker, Hitler's rage eventually cooled into something more dangerous, resignation and determination. If Steiner would not save Berlin, then Berlin would become a funeral pyre worthy of the Third Reich's apocalyptic vision. Orders went out declaring the capital a fortress to be defended to the last man, woman, and child. The Narrow Decree, which mandated the destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure to prevent it from falling into Allied hands, was reinforced. If Germany could not have victory, it would have Götterdämmer, a twilight of the gods where everything burned together. But north of Berlin, in the positions held by Detachment Steiner, a different calculus was taking place. The men under Steiner's command, most of whom had no idea they had been designated as the instrument of Berlin's salvation, simply continued to exist. They held defensive positions, they managed their dwindling supplies, they watched the horizon for Soviet advances, and crucially, they survived another day.
The mathematics of survival. As Berlin descended into its final agony, Felix Steiner faced a secondary crisis that would prove equally consequential: what to do with the thousands of men under his command as the Reich's last hours approached. The military situation had moved beyond any possibility of meaningful resistance. Soviet forces were systematically crushing the remaining German pockets. The question was no longer how to win, or even how to delay defeat. It was how to survive the transition from war to captivity, and whether that survival would come with a butcher's bill attached. The precedent for what happened to German forces in the final collapse was terrifying. Throughout the Eastern Front, Soviet treatment of captured SS personnel was notoriously harsh and often fatal. The Red Army had seen what the SS had done during the invasion of the Soviet Union: the massacres of civilians, the scorched earth policies, the deliberate starvation of prisoners, the murder of political commissars, the active participation in Holocaust operations. Soviet soldiers and officers knew about Babi Yar, about the Einsatzgruppen, about the destruction of entire villages. Revenge was not an abstraction. It was a tangible force that shaped how surrendering SS men were treated. Steiner understood that his men wore the runes of an organization synonymous with atrocity. The double lightning bolts of the SS were not merely insignia, they were markers that could mean the difference between becoming a prisoner of war and being executed on the spot. Some SS units attempted to remove their insignia or claim they were Wehrmacht, but such deceptions were risky and often unsuccessful. Soviet intelligence was sophisticated. They knew how to identify SS personnel through tattoos, documents, and interrogation. The alternative to Soviet captivity was surrender to Western Allied forces, particularly the Americans or British, whose treatment of prisoners generally adhered more closely to Geneva Convention standards. This created a desperate calculus in the final weeks. Commanders throughout Germany attempted to move their forces westward, hoping to surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets. This was not merely about avoiding harsh treatment, it was about survival itself. Steiner made the strategic decision to move his forces away from direct confrontation with Soviet armies and toward positions where surrender to Western forces might be possible. This was not a simple retreat, it was a carefully managed withdrawal that required maintaining unit cohesion, avoiding encirclement, and navigating through a collapsing front where German units were disintegrating, refugees clogged every road, and Soviet forces were advancing on multiple axes. The moral complexity of this decision cannot be understated. Steiner was actively preserving men who wore the uniform of an organization responsible for industrialized genocide. Some of these men were undoubtedly war criminals. Others were combat soldiers who had fought in conventional military operations. Many were recent conscripts who had barely received training before being thrown into the SS's depleted ranks. The question of collective guilt versus individual responsibility was one that would haunt post-war tribunals and historical memory for decades. But in the immediate context of April-May 1945, Steiner's focus was narrower and more pragmatic, preventing a final, pointless massacre. The military value of continued resistance was zero. Germany had unconditionally lost. Every hour of fighting served only to increase casualties on all sides and destroy what little remained of German cities and infrastructure. The romantic notion of fighting to the last man might have appealed to Nazi ideology, but it was antithetical to any rational assessment of the situation. Hitler's suicide on April 30th removed the central node of the command structure, but it did not immediately end the war. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz assumed leadership of what remained of the German government, and his priority became negotiating a surrender that would allow as many German forces as possible to escape Soviet captivity. This aligned with Steiner's own calculations and provided a framework, however chaotic, for managed surrender. The final days saw Detachment Steiner conducting a fighting withdrawal, not to achieve military objectives, but to buy time and distance. They avoided major engagements where possible, conserving ammunition and lives. They moved westward through a landscape of apocalypse, burning villages, columns of refugees, abandoned equipment, and the detritus of a civilization that had set the world on fire and was now consuming itself. On May 2, 1945, Berlin officially fell to Soviet forces. The fighting in the city had been savage, block by block, building by building. German defenders, including SS units, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth children pressed into combat, had inflicted significant casualties on Soviet forces, but the outcome was never in doubt.
The Reich Chancellor was captured, the bunker was secured, Hitler's body, partially burned in a hasty cremation, was discovered by Soviet troops. But Felix Steiner and the bulk of his forces were not in Berlin. They had moved northwest into areas where British forces were advancing. This geographical repositioning was the culmination of Steiner's refusal, not merely the refusal to attack on April 21st, but the sustained refusal to commit his men to suicidal last stands that would serve no purpose beyond ideological theater. When Steiner finally surrendered, it was to British forces. The exact circumstances varied. Some units surrendered in organized formations, others dissolved as individual soldiers sought to escape Soviet capture. But the critical outcome was that thousands of men who would almost certainly have died in a futile attack on Soviet positions, or who would have been executed upon capture as SS personnel, instead survived to become prisoners of war. The number of lives saved is impossible to calculate with precision. If Steiner had obeyed Hitler's order on April 21st, his forces would have been annihilated within days, adding perhaps 10 to 15,000 casualties to the war's final toll. By refusing and then managing a strategic withdrawal, he preserved not just his soldiers but potentially thousands of civilians who would have been caught in the combat zones of a continued offensive. This was not heroism in any conventional sense. Steiner did not save these lives out of humanitarian enlightenment or moral awakening. He was not a resistance figure who had secretly opposed the regime. He was a professional soldier making tactical decisions based on military realities and personal survival instincts. The fact that these decisions resulted in mass preservation of life does not erase his service to one of history's most criminal regimes.
The Ledger of History. In the decades following Germany's surrender, Felix Steiner became a figure of profound historical ambiguity, a man whose final actions saved thousands of lives, yet whose career had been spent in service to a regime dedicated to industrialized murder. This duality raises questions that resist simple answers. Can a single act of refusal redeem years of complicity? Does tactical pragmatism that preserves life carry moral weight when exercised by someone who enabled atrocity through institutional participation? Where does Felix Steiner belong in the ledger of history? Steiner himself lived until 1966, dying at the age of 70 in Munich. In his post-war years, he became part of a community of former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS officers who attempted to rehabilitate the reputation of German military forces by drawing distinctions between the clean Wehrmacht and the criminal Nazi Party apparatus. This narrative, which historians have thoroughly dismantled, sought to portray soldiers as apolitical professionals who had simply done their duty, separate from the ideological crimes of the regime they served. Steiner wrote memoirs and gave interviews in which he presented himself as a military reformer who had modernized SS tactical doctrine and maintained professional standards against ideological interference. He emphasized his conflicts with Himmler over training methods and his focus on combat effectiveness over racial indoctrination. These claims contained elements of truth. Steiner had indeed clashed with SS leadership on military matters, but they also conveniently omitted the larger context of what the Waffen-SS represented and enabled. The Waffen-SS was not merely a military organization. It was the armed wing of the same institution that operated the concentration camps, implemented the final solution, and carried out mass executions across occupied Europe. While Steiner's units were primarily combat formations rather than Einsatzgruppen and death squads, the distinction became murky in practice. Waffen-SS divisions participated in anti-partisan operations that frequently blurred into massacres of civilians. They operated in territories where genocide was being systematically implemented, and their presence contributed to the infrastructure of occupation that made the Holocaust possible. Steiner's division Wiking, which he commanded earlier in the war, fought extensively on the Eastern Front, where the conflict was explicitly framed by Nazi ideology as a war of racial extermination. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS operated in coordination with SS and police units implementing genocidal policies. The notion that one could serve as a senior SS commander while remaining somehow separate from the regime's criminal enterprise is historically untenable. Yet the refusal of April 21st remains historically significant precisely because it was so rare. The overwhelming majority of German commanders, regardless of their private doubts, continued to obey orders until the absolute end. Cities were defended to rubble. Divisions fought until they ceased to exist. The final weeks of the war saw senseless casualties on all sides because the command structure continued to function, even as its strategic purpose had evaporated. Hitler's final days were filled with orders for counterattacks by armies that no longer existed, for deployments of units that had been destroyed weeks earlier, for offensives that lived only on outdated maps in the bunker. Most commanders either obeyed these delusional commands or found ways to appear to comply while minimizing damage. Outright refusal was extraordinarily dangerous and correspondingly rare.
What made refusal possible for Steiner was a confluence of factors: the advanced collapse of the command structure, his geographical distance from Berlin, the chaos of communications in the final weeks, and his calculation that the regime no longer possessed the capacity to enforce punishment. But possibility is not the same as inevitability. Other commanders in similar positions chose differently. They sent their men forward into pointless attacks. They executed deserters. They maintained discipline through terror even as the world burned around them. The question of whether Steiner's refusal constitutes redemption is ultimately unanswerable, because redemption is a theological concept, not a historical one. History can only record actions and analyze contexts. Steiner served the Third Reich for years. He wore its uniform, commanded its forces, participated in its wars of aggression and extermination. He also, at the final moment, chose not to add thousands more deaths to the catastrophic toll. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Steiner's story illustrates the tragic insufficiency of late-stage moral choices. His refusal mattered immensely to the men whose lives it saved, and to their families and descendants. In that narrow but profound sense, it was an unequivocal good. But it did not erase what came before, nor did it transform Steiner into a hero of resistance. The broader lesson extends beyond Steiner himself to the nature of authoritarian systems and the psychology of obedience. The Nazi regime depended on millions of individual choices to follow orders, to prioritize loyalty over morality, to fragment responsibility across bureaucratic chains so that no single person felt accountable for the whole. Steiner's refusal demonstrated that even within such systems, agency existed, choices were possible. The costs were high, but they were not infinite. What haunts the historical imagination is the counterfactual. What if more commanders had made similar choices earlier in the war? What if refusal had become systemic rather than exceptional? The Holocaust and the war's vast destruction depended on functional compliance from military and civilian bureaucracies. Individual resistance could not have stopped the machinery of genocide once it was fully operational, but systemic resistance might have prevented it from reaching that scale. Steiner's story also raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember the war and assign moral categories. Popular narratives prefer clear heroes and villains, resistance fighters and collaborators, liberators and perpetrators. But history is dense with figures who resist such categorization, people who made terrible choices and occasionally humane ones, who enabled atrocity while performing isolated acts of decency, whose legacies are irreducibly complex. In the end, Felix Steiner saved thousands of lives by refusing an order in the final days of a collapsing genocidal regime that he had served faithfully for years. This action deserves acknowledgement without veneration, recognition without rehabilitation. The men who survived because of his refusal lived to see families and futures that would have been extinguished in a futile attack. That matters, but it exists alongside, not instead of, the larger historical record of what the SS represented and what Steiner's service to it enabled. History's ledger does not balance. There is no equation that weighs lives saved against complicity in a criminal regime and produces a final verdict. There is only the stubborn complexity of human choices made in extremity, recorded for subsequent generations to examine, to argue over, and to learn from, understanding that the lessons are never simple and that the capacity for both terrible and humane choices exists in the same individual, often separated by nothing more than a moment of decision in the wreckage of a collapsing world.